Throughout history, people have used honor and shame to transform cultures. All cultures have some sort of honor code that determines how people live, how they relate, how they raise their children, and countless other things. In order to change various evil practices around us, we must challenge common perspectives about what is honorable or shameful. But how do we do that? In this session, we'll consider a few examples of how people have used honor and shame to bring about moral revolutions. What do we mean by a moral revolution? We refer to rapid changes in people's moral behavior over a relatively short period of time. In other words, the moral behaviors of a society usually change over centuries. Yet, how might we spur these changes to happen more quickly? Perhaps in a matter of a few years or a decade. As we think about these examples, we want you to use your imagination. Reflect on certain behaviors that need to be changed around you in your community. Then, begin to imagine ways that we might challenge and transform how people live and see the world. Here's Jackson Wu to take us further.
In a book called The Honor Code, a scholar looks at several examples in history of moral revolutions. For example, he looks at the old Chinese practice of foot binding. By the 19th century, upper-class women were expected to have their feet bound. It was a sign of elevated status. Small feet were judged as beautiful. How did they bind a woman's feet? The process begins when they were small children. One person describes it this way. First, her feet were plunged into hot water and her toenails clipped short. Then the feet were massaged and oiled before all the toes, except the big toes, were broken and bound flat against the sole, making a triangle shape. Next, her arch was strained as the foot was bent double. Finally, the feet were bound in place using a silk strip measuring 10 feet long and 2 inches wide. These wrappings were briefly removed every 2 days to prevent blood and pus from infecting the foot. Sometimes excess flesh was cut away or encouraged to rot. The girls were forced to walk long distances in order to hasten the breaking of their arches. Over time, the wrappings became tighter and the shoes smaller as the heel and sole were crushed together. After 2 years, the process was complete, creating a deep cleft that could hold a coin in place. Once a foot had been crushed and bound, the shape could not be reversed without a woman undergoing the same pain all over again. There are several reasons for this practice. Despite the pain, Chinese women were advocates for the practice. This is one of the reasons it persisted for hundreds of years. They saw it as beautiful and a way to ensure their daughters would win a husband. Also, men saw foot binding as a way of making sure that women remained chaste or sexually pure, since they could not easily wander off. In China, people mocked and ridiculed women with normal-sized feet. Eventually, the battle over foot binding became more of a battle over Chinese identity and social standing, particularly for the intellectuals. As Chinese people grew to dislike outsiders, especially Westerners, foot binding was regarded as a symbol of Chinese identity. The Chinese imperial family bound the feet of their daughters. Nevertheless, the practice changed. Why? Change came from the lower level social leaders. These lower officials did not emphasize the honor of individuals, but rather the honor of the entire nation. Keep in mind that we all share honor and shame with others in our community. By the early 20th century, China wanted to increase their influence in the world. They wanted the respect of Japan and other Western countries. One lower-level official wrote the following to the Chinese emperor: "Foreigners have been taking pictures and laughing at us for these things and criticizing us for being barbarians. There is nothing which makes us objects of ridicule so much as foot binding. I, your humble servant, feel deeply ashamed at heart." Ultimately, the concern for the honor of their nation and their group identity led China to eliminate the 1,000-year practice. Opponents of foot binding contrasted China with other nations in order to show that women could remain chaste or sexually pure even without foot binding. Small groups of people in influential circles began to allow, and even require, their sons to marry women with unbound feet. In a later video, I'll talk about how honor and shame were used during the Arab Spring, beginning in 2010 to 2011. For now, I'll briefly mention an example of how honor and shame became tools for improving the health and safety of women in India. I'll quote an article that explained the situation faced by Indian women. It says, "Like most of northern India, Haryana values males much more than females. Even before birth, males often receive far better care, while females face a high risk of selective abortion because of their gender. Once born, girls continue to face discrimination through constraints on health care, movement, education, or employment. However, they also face much higher risk of violence due to the widespread practice of open defecation." In 1999, the Indian government began the Total Sanitation Campaign. Now, a major goal of the effort was to increase the number of toilets in people's homes. So they began the slogan, "No toilet, no bride." Between 2005 and 2009, more than 1.4 million toilets were built in the northern state of Haryana. In one village, women used a name and shame approach. One Indian woman said, "We started to make lists of people who squatted in the open." Another woman adds, "In the local government meetings, those names were read out." And guess what? The strategy worked. Humiliated by being publicly identified for defecating in the public, the men agreed to build private toilets. The men were publicly shamed for defecating in the open. Rather than suffer humiliation, the men agreed to building private toilets. The campaign created a healthy way of shaming people into building toilets. Men wanted to avoid potential shame, which could even lead to not having a wife. So they decided to build toilets on their own initiative. Honor and shame can motivate long-lasting change in ways that making laws might not. Laws are often ignored. Laws can change with new government leaders. Certainly, creating good laws is helpful, but we ultimately want to see people have a change of heart, a new way of thinking and behaving. We know some people might doubt whether honor and shame are good tools to change moral behaviors. Here are two reasons honor and shame are necessary. First, when people have internalized a healthy and just sense of honor, they will behave in moral ways even when no one is watching. Citizens often obey laws only when an authority watches over them. Second, laws rarely motivate people to do extraordinary acts of sacrifice and love. With laws, a person asks, "What do I have to do?" However, a sense of honor motivates people to take risks and to love in tremendous ways because Honor concerns one's sense of identity. We want to be the type of people who live honorably and not shamefully.
We will close this discussion by offering a few questions that can help you identify key situations around you that need a moral revolution. Perhaps you already have some ideas in mind. What are a few widespread moral behaviors that need to be changed? For each problem you list, ask the following questions. Who are the key people involved? What are the honor-shame motivations that cause the behavior to continue? What are some of the assumptions and values that need to be challenged? In what ways might we help people to see that the shame that comes with the behavior is greater than the perceived honor? How might we help people to see that changing behavior will bring people more honor, not less?